Hello, people. Welcome back to Analyzing the Golden Plates Eyewitnesses, where we will analyze every single eyewitness to the Golden Plates, including the 11 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And in the third video in this series, we were looking at Joseph Knight Sr., who was the wealthy miller and farmer who basically sponsored the translation process. Just as a disclaimer, I did try to be honest, but I have bias, so you're warned. And also, check the description for a detailed script with my sources. Alright, when it comes to the early church history, Joseph Knight Sr. definitely falls into the theological narrative side of the story. He was a devout believer until his death on the pioneer trail. But this guy didn't claim to see an angel in the woods, and he didn't formally inspect the golden plates. Instead, he was physically present the night the plates were supposedly retrieved, and he provided the exact finances that made the entire religion possible. Research points to only one primary document where Knight speaks for himself about these events, alongside a few secondary accounts that corroborate his actions. I also included the images of the subjects when referencing the relevant data, so you know exactly which sources says what. Now this is where we get into part one, the history and the testimony. Joseph Knight Sr. was born in 1772 in Massachusetts, but eventually settled in Broome County, New York. And unlike the Smith family, who were pretty poor, Joseph Knight Sr. was a fairly well-off industrialist. His son, Joseph Knight Jr., talked extensively about his dad's business ventures. And this is a really crucial baseline to establish, that Knight was a pragmatic boss who managed real assets and not some desperate, gullible follower. Now, they lived in the burnt-over district of New York, which was an area that was just saturated in folk magic. And on top of that, the Knights were also universalists, so they think everyone goes to heaven, which is a really uncommon belief at the time. So you could argue that this theological flexibility left them primed to listen to a guy like Joseph Smith. And in 1826, Joseph Smith was in the region because he had been hired by Josiah Stoll to use his seer stone to hunt for a legendary lost Spanish silver mine. And it was during this time Knight also hired Smith as a day laborer and mill worker, and the two got really close. And it's because of this intense trust, the Knights were among the very first people outside the immediate Smith family to hear about the ancient record. Knight's manuscript actually starts off by retelling the backstory Joseph told him, flashing back to 1823, 3 years before they even met. Here's how Knight's retelling goes. On September 21st, 1823, Joseph goes onto the hill Cumorah to receive the golden plates from the angel Moroni. But Moroni refuses to give them until he brings his brother, Alvin Smith, 1 year later. But there's a tragic problem. Before the next year arrived, Alvin unexpectedly died. So, when the year is up, Joseph comes back and the angel is now kind of vague about his demands. And instead of asking for his brother this time, the angel says he'll just know who to bring. And Joseph uses his seer stone and realizes the new target is Emma Hale, who becomes his future wife. In order to court her, Joseph Smith asked Joseph Knight Sr. to foot the bill, framing it as advancing a divine mission. And this is where Knight actually enters the picture logistically. So flash forward to 1827. Joseph Smith brings Emma, leaves her at the bottom of the hill in Knight's wagon, and finally gets the plates. But apparently the night he gets the plates, he borrowed Knight's wagon without asking, which genuinely pisses Knight off. Knight notes that when Joseph Smith eventually gets back, he seems more interested in a seer stone than the actual golden plates. So skeptics will say that Smith is acting really sketchy here, because why would a prophetic, foreseeing angel tell Smith to bring his brother only for his brother to die of sickness 2 months later? Unless, of course, there was no angel and Smith just didn't anticipate the death when forming the lie. And the apologists will counter. They'll say, if Joseph was lying to the Knights in 1826, why even mention Alvin? Why not just leave that embarrassing detail out? And the skeptic's answer is because Joseph had to keep his story straight. Because he had already told his mom and his whole family the Alvin rule back in 1823, he got trapped in his own narrative plot hole and had to find a magical way out. That's why the second time he goes to the hill, the burden is magically shifted to Emma. Also, Knight's gritty description of this spirit doesn't match the biblical idea of an angel at all. It fits perfectly with the local folklore of the treasure guardians of the burnt-over district, and Joseph's fixation with the stone rather than the plates seems to kind of feed right into that idea too. And this is when we get into part two, which is the finances. The truth is, translating the plates cost money, and Smith simply didn't have any, so our boy Joseph Knight Sr. stepped in. He started out as a supportive former boss to the primary venture capitalist of the movement. One of the things Knight did was be a delivery man. Knight made several trips from Colesville, New York to Harmony, Pennsylvania and Susquehanna County, which was like a 30-mile journey to deliver goods to the scribes. His deliveries kind of started off small, but then they picked up a lot and heavily when Oliver Cowdery showed up, providing the food. That way the men could just focus on the translating. One of the things he transported was like the actual manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which was written on paper that he bought himself. But soon, Smith's demand spiked, and it put Knight, who was a once wealthy man, into poverty. When the prophet's fiscal demands rose, it literally cost Knight Jr. the land he was saving for a house. And so, believing Joseph, the family systematically gave everything they had, and it wasn't just groceries. Joseph Knight Sr. even paid for 2 defense lawyers when Joseph Smith was arrested in New York on disorderly conduct charges. And this is when we get into part 3. The apologist versus the skeptic breakdowns. Now, for the apologist, Joseph Knight Sr. isn't some gullible stooge. He's a wealthy, pragmatic industrialist. He knew how to handle money and wouldn't just blindly flock money and sell off property to a con man. He had a deep relationship with Smith and knew his character. Also, Knight's testimony doesn't shy away from folk magic concepts like the glasses and the personages, which shows its authenticity. But the biggest red flag with this is that it's entirely inferential, which is why the skeptics don't question the authenticity too much. Knight never actually saw the plates uncovered. He just saw Smith and Emma returning in the morning. Knight believed he was funding the translation of an ancient record simply because Joseph told him he was. So why would a smart businessman fall for this? The burnt-over district was swimming in folklore. Because Knight had already hired Joseph Smith back when Joseph was acting as a village seer, looking for buried treasure, it's probable he likely would accept the magic rock. The big point is that after all the massive expenses, Knight fell victim to the ultimate sunk cost fallacy. Because Knight has already invested his life savings and social standing into Joseph's divine calling, he had to justify those expenditures. To admit Joseph was a fraud would mean admitting he had been duped. But an apologist will immediately push back on this because the sunk cost fallacy must have a breaking point. It's one thing to lose money on paper and groceries, and it's an entirely other thing to face mob violence, starvation, and the freezing conditions of Jackson County, Missouri. And this is where the LDS idea of the law of consecration comes in. When the Saints moved west, members were asked to officially deed their property to the church. And Knight notes that while others backed out, he didn't. And Knight's lifelong devotion, ending with his death on the Pioneer Trail, proves his conviction. But the skeptic argues that the law of consecration was less about divine conviction and more about the ultimate socioeconomic trap. People willingly give up everything and even die for causes they believe to be true across all the religious spectrums, like Islamic jihadists or even Christian martyrs. And so dying for a belief proves your sincerity, but not the historical truth of the belief. So the skeptic's case relies on sociological lock-in. So by the time things got violent, Knight had already given away his empire. He literally had nowhere else to go. But what about the sources? Obviously, they're all biased toward the church, but that does not disprove them. Knight Sr.'s private manuscript is highly trusted because it's raw and uncorrelated by the church. His sons, Newell and Joseph Jr., were also loyal, but highly reliable witnesses to the financial logistics. Conversely, Lucy Mack Smith's memoir was dictated 2 decades later to defend her family's legacy, with Brigham Young even saying it had mistakes. But I personally think it still includes reliable corroborating timeline details, so I'm going to trust it for the basics. Finally, Joseph Smith's official history is undeniably biased. It's written a decade after the fact. It was designed to retroactively establish his divine authority. And so I am personally very cautious of Joseph Smith's official telling, but the logistical details seem to align with the other accounts, so I'm going to trust him on those specific overlaps. So, what is the final verdict of Joseph Knight Sr.'s testimony? There is little historical reason to doubt his claims and the money he did pour into the church, but his witness to the divine is entirely inferential. So despite his loyalty to the movement, Knight does not add much proof to the ancient nature of the plates, but he does show how even the most financially literate, practical men of that era could be inspired to give up absolutely everything for a cause. Now, I personally don't think Knight was lying, but I do think he was an honest man who was conned by Smith and utilized for his resources. If you think there was anything I missed, or anything I got wrong, or just general thoughts, let me know in the comments below. But it's been real, and it's been fun, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye!